About ready. Here we go.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Why do JavaScript developers use Sencha Ext JS, hosted by Sencha? My name is Raj Viyuru. I'm a marketing manager at Sencha and be moderating today's webinar. I am pleased to introduce today's presenter, Marc Gusmano, Senior Sales Engineer at Sencha. Before I hand the mic over to Marc to kick off the webinar, I would like to take a moment to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand on the BrightTalk platform. Additionally, we will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please submit it via questions panel. Marc, you now have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Raj, and welcome everyone. And I'm excited to present this webinar to you. Again, I am Marc Gusmano, sales engineer here at Sencha. And the topic for today is why do JavaScript developers choose Sencha Ext JS? And we thought we'd take you through a little bit of a story that some of you probably have experienced already, or some of you will experience. We're going to meet Joe. And Joe is a software architect at a large company. So some of you may indeed be software architects or lead developers or someone involved in some of the decision making of what you're going to use to build your applications. So Joe and his company build very data-centric business applications. And that's very typical for organizations that are considering building applications. A lot of data may flow through. You may have a lot of grids in your application to support that data-oriented activity. So the company's decided that they're going to develop web-based front-end applications. And there's a lot of good reasons to go this route. A user merely needs a browser to be able to get at the application. The ability to build a client-oriented front end with a server backend serving the data can lend towards a very performant application. So Joe has been tasked to do the needed research to build these web front-end applications. And he knows that there are different web development frameworks that are out there. So he's going to begin to look into which of these frameworks might meet the needs of his organization. So Joe starts into this research effort, and he's kind of frustrated. He realizes he has many options. First of all, you could go without a framework. The basis of building web applications is really the underlying capabilities of plain HTML, cascading style sheets or CSS, and the programming language JavaScript. And you can indeed build applications just using the fundamental aspects of the web application development framework. But Joe realizes that there are a lot of open source solutions out there. There are many open source solutions out there. A couple that bubble to the top, a couple that tend to be more popular, and ones that are used more than maybe the rest of the pack are Angular from Google and React from Facebook. But as I said, there are many others. Joe feels that maybe limiting his research to these will gain him the greatest benefit. So he embarks on his research to understand what the pluses and minuses are of each of these frameworks. First off, the lack framework, or what a lot of people call vanilla JS, the ability to just use the underlying HTML, CSS, and JavaScript environments. In this environment, you're going to have the most flexibility because you can do whatever those three environments allow you to do, but you have to do everything from scratch. You have to build components, you have to build routing, you have to build your security infrastructure. So that approach is very time consuming, and time is money. So it's going to be very expensive. It's error prone. So that might not be the best way to go. So looking at the two popular frameworks that Joe chose, Angular and React, he realizes a couple of things. First off, they are open source, which means that they're community supported. They're based on an MIT open source license. But the biggest thing Joe starts to realize is that those core frameworks are indeed just that, core frameworks. One of the biggest things that Joe likes about the web is that you can build components and use those components in your application. But both Angular and React have no built-in components. There is a third-party marketplace, whether that be commercial components or open source components, but those decisions have to be made after you pick one of these particular frameworks. So there's work to be done even beyond the decision to pick a framework. There's also compatibility issues and a lot of things around the need to piece together your entire framework based on the fact that you don't get everything with these open source web frameworks. So Joe considers Ext JS. He's heard about it. We're here obviously talking about it. Ext JS or Ext JS, however you like to pronounce it, is a complete framework. It has more than 140 components in the box. It's been around for a while. The first version of Ext JS was more than a decade ago, and there's been quite a good amount of evolution to the product. It is used quite extensively by big companies building data-centric applications, but Joe is doing research and he needs to see more. So we start taking this journey with Joe to figure out if Ext JS is the right product. And really the first thing to do if you're going to take a look at the product is get a trial of the product, which takes you to the Try Ext JS homepage. So the link I have here is to sencha.com evaluation. And an evaluation for Ext JS is pretty straightforward. You get a 30-day trial that gives you all of the capabilities of the product. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what's there. You simply fill out this download trial form, download the trial, and once you have it downloaded, you're immediately brought to what I'll call a quick start to get started with the product. So here we've jumped into the documentation. We're able to install what we've downloaded. And at the end of this, you're able to build your initial application that allows you to at least get familiar with the beginning processes of using Ext JS. So he looks at that. Joe also wants to understand the licensing options. He knows that these other open source products are MIT licensed. He's looking more for a supported commercial license. So a good review of the licensing models here helps Joe understand what it is he has the ability to acquire. And with Ext JS, there are essentially two licenses. There's a Pro and there's an Enterprise. And as you notice here on this page, the Pro gives you the standard Ext JS SDK and a few developer tools. The Enterprise includes all of those things and includes some of what I'll call premium components, a D3 adapter, a pivot grid, a calendar, and also includes a license for Sencha Test. So Joe is interested in both. He's intrigued by these new components. What do they do? And how Sencha Test fits into the mix. So he'll consider that. There's also a look at the documentation. So the Sencha documentation, which is at docs.sencha.com. He's already seen it when he got started by installing the trial. But in terms of starting to understand the product, for example, Joe's particularly interested in the grid capabilities. He has the ability to do a search and take a look at the extensiveness of the documentation. So here, for example, we're looking at the documentation for the grid. We notice there's quite a few configs, quite a few properties, methods, and events. We have examples, a good level of documentation. So that's a good overview for Joe to understand that he will have the documentation support available for the product. As I mentioned, though, he and most people building enterprise data-centric applications are particularly interested in the one component that tends to be the core of those types of applications, and that's the grid. So in particular, Joe wants to understand the capabilities of the Ext JS Grid. So there's a page out on the Sencha website specifically focused on the grid, sencha.com/grid, which has a few things that are interesting to take a look at. One, it talks a lot about performance. That's the big thing about a grid. You want it to perform well. Most grids or data tables or components that are oriented towards data do fine when you're showing relatively few rows, tens, maybe even 100. But what if you get into the thousands or tens of thousands of rows? What if you need split-second performance when you're talking about that level of data? Well, there's really a couple of areas that you want to look at when you're looking at a grid. How well does it render the data? Because the DOM in the browser is about one of the slowest things that you need to deal with when you're building a web application. And how is it in handling the retrieval of that data back in the backend server? So he's particularly interested about that. He notices that there's some benchmarking that's been done based on some of the other grids that are out there. So probably about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, looks like 2 years ago, Sencha embarked on a comparison of grid performance in the industry. So there's a blog here he can take a look at. There's also a grid analyzer that was built in conjunction with that study, which is used to compare and contrast the performance of different use cases or different scenarios. So that's an interesting thing that Joe may try out to actually see the performance of the grid. And because the grid is such a crucial part of a web development framework decision, looking at the types of capabilities that the grid has or the different features that it has is really crucial. So this particular page shows off some of the capabilities of the grid: grouping, locking columns. There's an editing category, drag and drop. And what's nice about it is that it's categorized. So if I want to really understand, how row operations work and grouping data from that standpoint works, I can see all that. I get a little bit of a sense of the performance because I'm actually using an Ext JS application. And then what's really nice on the right-hand side here is that I'm getting the code that is necessary to be able to use that. So Joe starts to understand that, a lot of this is JavaScript. A lot of it is not dealing with the low-level HTML. A lot of it is dealing with configuring components. The idea of having components is really a fundamental part of Ext JS. And with the grid, he's starting to see how you can configure those components. And he remembers that if he wants to understand which configs he needs to use or which events he may want to listen to, that the documentation was organized in that way. So really, when you look at Ext JS, it's a rather unique approach. It's a very synergistic approach to building applications to some of the popular development languages like Java or .NET. So he realizes that, hey, with his staff that he has, some of the staff are professional programmers who understand object orientation and understand the ability to build components, to extend components. And so that aspect of the product is intriguing. So he wants to see more. And one of the best places to see more about what components exist and how they work within an EXTJ application is an example application built by Sencha called the kitchen sink. And the kitchen sink, as it implies, is all of the components that are available to you as a developer in one place. So it showcases over 140 components in categories, so it's easy to find. And it also highlights some of those enterprise components that Joe saw. He saw that there was a professional version and an enterprise version. So he's going to have to make a decision if he goes with Ext.js. Do I get the professional or enterprise? And it really centers around the enterprise components. Something called D3 and a D3 adapter, a pivot grid, some calendaring capabilities, and some advanced exporting. So Joe heads over to the kitchen sink. And as I said, the kitchen sink is an application built in Ext.js, categorized by the different component categories. So for example, if I'm interested in just the generic components that don't fall into any other category, I would click components and I can see all the different kind of fundamental components that are there. For example, buttons. And even something simple as a button has a lot of different dimensions to it. You may want to have icons, you may want to have splitter buttons, you may want to have menu buttons. So Joe is starting to realize that this is a pretty comprehensive set of components that are able to be used. And just like that example with the grid I showed you, on the right-hand side here is code to show you how to utilize what you might see here. So for example, if he came into here and looked at the different capabilities that are out here, he'll see grids. He'll see some of the core features of a grid, and even a basic grid with very little customization. We've got some icons here. We've got different rendering. I can scroll through here. He can see that this is a very straightforward config-based environment. I'm extending a grid panel. I'm using a data store, and I'm defining my columns. So what's really nice about this kitchen sink documentation is that I can use this. I can copy and paste this code into my application. One of the other things that he finds the framework following is some of the more modern development patterns. There are patterns called MVC and MVVM, and those patterns, model view controller, for example, or model view model. Those are all patterns that are accepted as best practices, and Ext.js follows those. And even this documentation and this example here follows that best practice. So I have my view or my user interface. I have my controller or the code that supports the interface. And I have my data-oriented store and model. So the best practices built into the product is highly encouraged and even built into the examples that a developer might select when they're building their application. So he looks at all of those. He also, as I had mentioned, is intrigued by some of the advanced components, the enterprise components. So if I take a look really quickly at what those are, I can see here that charting is a complete package. I get everything I need to do with charting. But if I want to go beyond charting and integrate with the open source D3 visualization library, I can do that within Ext.js. So as a quick example, if I want to use some of the capabilities to show data in a more enveloping way than what I can do with just regular charting, in this case, this little bubble chart here, I can do that with the integration of D3. And as I said, if I want to know how that's done, I just come over here and I see that Sencha provides a D3 pack component, and that allows me to create one of these very advanced visualizations with very little code. So there's a D3 there. That's intriguing from a visualization point of view. There are pivot grids available. So if the applications that Joe's company is going to build is going to utilize a lot of data analytics, similar to what you might do with the pivot tables within Excel. Ext JS comes with a component that allows you to do that within the application. So being able to pivot on data, being able to build pivots programmatically, and also being able to export those pivots into Excel with full fidelity of a pivot grid, again, for a very analytic oriented application, could be a big advantage. So we have that decision point, do I need some of these advanced components? Very, very valuable for a data-centric application. And they're all available within the kitchen sink. There are also other supporting tools that are part of the product and are built in synergy with the product. Being able to theme your application or change the look and feel of your application separate from the building of your application is quite complicated when you're using open source tools and you're building from a mix of different components from different vendors, from different open source libraries. Typically, each one of those has a different way to theme their components. So theming can become a very, very difficult exercise if you're mixing and matching components. Since Ext JS delivers all the components consistently to you, they all use the same theming environment. And Sencha has a visual tool to allow a designer to design that theme independent of the development effort. So theming, maybe not the first thing you think of when you're deciding on a framework, is very easy to do if all of your components are synchronized together. And having a visual tool really takes you to that next level. You also have to consider how your developers are going to develop. There are plenty of editors out there. As we know, most of the development is done in the JavaScript language, but you're building components, you're building visual elements. So it would be nice to have a drag and drop interface to be able to build your visual environment, to be able to hook into events by double clicking on elements that are visual in a tool. And indeed, one of the tools that comes with Ext JS that's part of the package is a tool called Sencha Architect. So Sencha Architect allows you to visually build your application, perhaps starting your team with that as you're building the UI. And then as you move into more advanced, maybe pure coding activity, move into one of the other popular editors like IntelliJ or Eclipse or Visual Studio Code, which has become quite popular nowadays. And even in those environments, Joe found out that there are plugins that Sencha has built to allow, for example, Visual Studio Code development to be assisted with Ext JS capabilities, code refactoring, the ability to do builds right within Visual Studio Code. So tool support is quite extensive. Also, one of the things that, again, is probably not at top of mind when you're thinking about a framework is the entire life cycle of building an application, what I'll call continuous integration. The fact that you're building your application, you're posting your changes to a source code control environment, like let's say Git. You then do a build, a nightly build. You want to have tests that have been created to be performed against that nightly build to see, in the previous day's work, have you broken anything? So building unit and functional tests to support your build process is a very important thing. Sencha Test, which is another tool that comes with the environment and is part of the enterprise toolkit, will help you build those tests that you need and is very intelligent about the component structure of Ext JS. So continuous integration using Sencha Test is a very intriguing aspect of the product that Joe wants to research further. So Sencha Test in and of itself has its own documentation. It allows the ability to build unit tests, so developers can build unit tests. You can have testing engineers build more functional tests. And with the Enterprise Edition, as I mentioned, every developer gets a Sencha Test license. So another reason to edge towards using the Enterprise Edition, because Joe is very aware of the benefits of continuous integration and building tests and building up tests over time. And so that becomes a big part of his decision point. So looking at all of this, really, Joe realizes that Ext JS is a full tool suite that supports the SDK. So the real decision that Joe has to make is, does he want to go with an environment where, except for the fundamental parts of the framework, every other thing that he's going to build into that environment is a decision, is work, is extra time? Or does he want to go with a tool that has a tool? Does he want to go with an SDK and a framework that has a tool suite, that has everything supported, that is consistent? So when a new version of the XJS environment comes out, all of the components are updated consistently. Does he want a consistent theming environment? And all of this, because it's a commercial license, is all supported. So if Joe's team needs help, there's a support portal. If Joe's team needs some expertise, there's expertise available, and it's all from the vendor that is providing you the capabilities, unlike the other open source tools, which are more community supported. So that's the big decision that Joe has to make. And in looking at all of this, no wonder Joe is convinced. He chooses XJS, but that decision is really a point in time. There are still other things that Joe needs to do, and other resources, other capabilities that are available to him. But he's convinced that this is the right way to go. He's been given a first project to do. So he's got a period of time to prove this out. And that's a typical thing, I think a smart thing to do. Start out with a pilot project. Start out with a proof of concept project. Give yourself a timeline. In this case, Joe has agreed to a timeline of 6 months. Let's see what we can build in 6 months. And we're just starting with a new framework. So the first thing that has to happen, of course, is Joe needs to purchase the licenses for XJS. He has decided that the Enterprise Edition, with its inclusion of those premium components and with the addition of Sencha Test, are well worth buying the Enterprise Edition. So he goes ahead and makes that decision. He points his development team now at a place where they can go to learn about ExtJS. So one of the things that Sencha has done is provided a one-stop shop for learning about XJS. We call it the resources page. So you'll notice up here on the toolbar, there's a resources page. And if I click into resources here, I come to a page that essentially gives me all of the resources that I might want to take advantage of to learn the product. And it's more than just the ExtJS product, but since we're focusing on ExtJS, let's talk about that. So any and all videos, self-study videos that are very good at getting a new person started and learn the best practices way to use ExtJS. White papers, webinars like this webinar to help, gain some context to the product. Examples, not only examples that I've already showed you, things like the kitchen sink and examples in the documentation, but other places where we've provided examples, data sheets, case studies, a lot of blogging to give you context. And when it comes down to it, virtual classroom-based training. So if the right answer, and a lot of times I believe it is, the right answer is to send your team to a class. We've designed training so that it doesn't take up your whole day. We typically do half-day sessions virtual over a period of time so you can still get work done and start learning. And the key benefit of classroom-based training, especially if you have a team, is that you potentially can focus that training on the work that you're doing, and perhaps even have enough individuals where you can have your own custom training. So pretty extensive amount of resources that he points his development team to. Joe also realizes that as the development team learns, they're going to need a way, to simply learn so that they don't have to set up their whole environment, or maybe as they get into development, they have support issues and they need to communicate those support issues to the Sencha support team. So Joe also makes his team aware of a cloud-based tool that Sencha provides called Sencha Fiddle. So Sencha Fiddle gives you the ability to essentially build Ext applications in the cloud. So as you can see here, I have a folder structure. I have a very simple ExtJ application. I can click run and it runs. So I have the ability to create scenarios, maybe for learning. I have an ability to create use cases where I'm finding that the product maybe isn't working and maybe there's a bug that I can submit to support. I can use this tool to actually communicate to my other team members, maybe different techniques or ways I am doing things. So it's a very valuable tool to make your developers aware of early on. The other nice thing about working with a commercial vendor is that Joe has the option of bringing in Sencha experts into the process, whether that be experts that work alongside your team or alongside the development process as you evolve and you mature in your understanding. So Sencha Services is available to augment that. Sencha Services is a bit more formal. That's more of a project that you want to get someone involved in, and we've heard a lot of feedback that said I would like to have more of a individual kind of a la carte, if you want to call it that, service. So one of the newest things that has been defined is something called Sencha Advisory Services. Very, very similar, but it's more of a pay-as-you-go and use those services as you need them. So maybe you have a point issue, or maybe you're trying to build something very particular and you need a, not full-time involvement, but just enough time to get you over the expertise hump. That's what Sencha Advisory Services are all about. So Joe considers that in his application. And then finally, one very important thing, one distinguishing factor, he has the ability and does sign up his development team to the Sencha portal. So the Sencha portal, or the Sencha support portal, is the place where his developers can submit tickets, either for bugs or for things that don't quite seem to work as they need to, maybe for a better understanding. You use the support portal to download products. So I mentioned Sencha Architect, Sencha Themer. Any of those products that need to be downloaded are available in the support portal. So very unique that you are now in a supported environment and have the ability to communicate with the support team to access software for download, all within a managed Sencha site. So he gets his development team up and ready. So Joe spends time getting his team up to speed. He's committed to this first proof of concept and learns the type of applications that he can build. So fast forwarding his proof of concept 6 months later, Joe and his team realized that with Ext JS, you can build what we term a universal application, which gives you different profiles. And those different profiles allow you to target a phone, target a desktop, target a tablet. He also takes advantage of the ability to build a custom theme using the Sencha Themer product. And a very typical example of this type of application is an example application that we make available to you as a template for you to start. And in doing this, we created a fictitious company called Coworky. And you can see here that it's an employee directory, and we want you to be able to log in. Obviously, you wouldn't put the ID and password pre-filled, but we want you to know that there's a login capability in the application. And as you log in, we are brought to a pretty typical data-centric Ext JS application. So you can see here I have a menu on the left-hand side. The menu is showing employees, organizations, and fundamental of this application is the Ext JS Grid. So here's the grid with a lot of functionality, a lot of different formatting, very rich application. I have the ability to do database-oriented activities, creating employees, deleting employees. So it's a full, rich desktop application. But as I said, the team realized that they could build a universal application. So a universal application allows for the building of different device capabilities, like a phone. And you'll notice here that when I scroll to the employees, when I've been emulating a phone, it doesn't look very good because it's a grid that doesn't show up well on a mobile phone. But if I refresh this page and I show this page as a universal application, the single source environment of Ext.js in this particular case detected that this was a phone, realized that a grid was not the right answer for this particular page, and instead substituted a list, which is a more mobile-friendly component. Now, that did involve a little bit of work, a little bit of development work, but again, it's in the same source code application. The nice thing about this is that the entire back end of the application, all of the data access to get at employees, is all reusable between the desktop and the mobile device. So Joe's team has built a universal application with a desktop interface, with a mobile interface, and that mobile interface could be expanded to a tablet interface, and has built a very data-centric application going against their server, and has been able to do it and take advantage of all the tooling and capabilities that are a part of Ext.js. So that's our journey with Joe. He was able to successfully utilize and make the decisions that he needed to select Ext.js. As I said, there were some criteria that led him towards Ext.js. In his company's particular case, they wanted a supported environment. They wanted a licensable product. Joe chose, as I mentioned, the enterprise license, which when you buy an enterprise license, your first year of support is included. Subsequent years, there is a percentage, roughly 30-ish% support fee on an annual basis. And what that gives you is perpetual licensing from a developer perspective to everything that's built while you're supported. So when eventually we come out with version 8 of Ext.js, we're currently on version 7.5. Version 8 comes out, you are a support customer, you automatically get version 8. There's no additional fees. So enterprise license and support were very important in his decision. Speed to market was important. Speed to market in that he did not have to build a development environment. He did not have to search for development tools. He did not have to search for components. Everything was in the box. That can either be a positive or a negative. The positive for Joe and his organization is that they can focus on building the application. That's the speed to market aspect. I don't have to worry about all these architectural and tooling things. They're in the box. They're brought to me. So the tools available for XJS were a big reason for the decision. And of course, the technical depth of XJS. It has been around for a long time. We have been revising, enhancing the SDK, especially the grid. So performance is a given. So a lot of that technical depth was a big reason that Joe chose Ext.js. So essentially, he's able to build his applications faster with less cost. It doesn't take him as long because he doesn't have to participate in all those steps that we've taken care of for you, which in essence is lower risk. You have a support team behind you. You have a proven approach. You have training available. You have expertise available. So all of those things bundled together are the reasons that in this particular case, Joe chose Ext.js as his development environment. So hopefully with that, that gives you a lot of perspective on what am I looking for? What kind of things are there as I'm making my decisions with XJS? And with that, it'll help you make your decision if you're in this same situation. So with that, I think we want to take a pause for some questions and answers, and I will send it back to Raj to see if there indeed are any questions that we can answer.
Wonderful, Mark. Thank you for the presentation. It looks like we have few questions that have been submitted. If you are still with us and have a question, please submit it via questions panel. Yeah, here is the question number one. Is there a future plan to combine modern and classic toolkits?
Great question. So yeah, let me back up a little bit again, because there may be some people new to Ext JS, maybe pondering, what framework you wanted to use. So the reason that question exists is that for a long time, we've had Ext JS as a product out there, over a decade. And back then, it was primarily desktop focused, and it was in the world of Internet Explorer, that great browser from Microsoft. So it was wildly non-standard. It was very difficult to build a consistent application across browsers. So Ext JS was primarily focused on a consistent look and feel across browsers and a few other things. Also, there weren't sophisticated capabilities to do things like layout within the browser. CSS now allows you to do layout, but back then you couldn't. So we even had to invent that. A few years later, as mobile devices were starting to evolve, we decided to build a product called Sencha. We built our mobile product, and that product focused on modern browsers. It was called Sencha Touch. I'm sorry, for some reason I blanked on that. Sencha Touch was built focusing on mobile browsers and mobile devices. So it had mobile components in it, like the list I showed you. About version 5 of Ext JS, we decided to combine those products together. So there's only one product now, Ext JS, with two toolkits. The modern toolkit, which is the evolution of Sencha Touch, and the classic toolkit, which is the evolution of Ext JS. Since version 5, we've been bringing the modern toolkit to parity with the classic toolkit. In other words, we've been building desktop components. So now the modern toolkit, and in the latest version that's coming out, 7.6 is coming out within the month, and it has additional capabilities added to it to bring modern to more parity with classic. So today we have two toolkits, modern and classic. The question that was just asked was, are there any plans to combine those so there's only one toolkit in the future? The answer is yes. It's not as simple as it sounds. They're different enough that probably for the foreseeable future, we will have a classic toolkit and a modern toolkit. The one thing that is definite from Sencha is that we are not getting rid of either one of them. The classic toolkit and the modern toolkit are living on, and there are no decisions at all to get rid of one versus the other. So that's kind of where we sit right now. And I felt it was important to kind of give you guys the history of that, just in case you didn't know it.
Yep. Thanks, Mark, for the in-depth answer on the history here.
Sure.
Yeah. The next question we have, is it possible to integrate the third-party components to use with Sencha?
Great question. No, I probably over-focused on the fact that Ext JS has 140 components, and someone could listen to that and say, oh, well, what if I find something I really like? I can't use it. The answer is you absolutely can. Ext JS has been built to allow for extensibility. There are actually vendors out there who are selling third-party Ext JS components. And you can take anything that's out there and essentially integrate them. We did integration work with the D3 visualization library, for example. So the answer is yes, you can. The easiest way to do that is to find a vendor who is building Ext JS components. But short of that, any components can be integrated, because at the end of the day, Ext JS is the same JavaScript environment that every other framework is running under. So there may be a little bit of intricacy that is involved to get it to hook together, but we've had quite good success working with customers or hearing about customers that have integrated their own work or other third-party components.
Got it. Thank you, Mark. The next question we have, if we find something specific that we need to do that is not available in the box, can we create our own JavaScript components to expand Sencha capabilities?
Yep. Very similar, I guess, a bit to the previous question, but yes. So for example, let's say, and I have customers, I'm working with customers now who have this exact scenario. They love our grid, but they always want the grid to have certain features that we didn't put in the box. So what they've done is they've created their own grid class that inherits from our grid. Remember, I said Ext JS is built on the object-oriented paradigm. So it is very easy to subclass a component and add additional features. And then that component is the component that your development team uses. And that capability is by design. So you have that ability to build your own components. The other thing I will say is, because we're a commercial platform and you have a support portal, you can use the support portal. And I encourage customers to use the support portal to suggest things. So if you build something yourself and you say, you know, others would benefit from this, let us know. Let us know through the support portal, or let me know. We're always looking for innovative things to add to the framework. And the benefit of that is, if we do incorporate that, it's one less thing you have to maintain. So we're listening. We have a very robust MVP community that's suggesting things or helping with us crafting newer versions. So a solid yes to all the abilities to build custom components. And you want to think that way when you're using Ext JS. You want to build your own custom components because it saves you development time. That speed to market is partly achieved by taking the common elements that you want every developer to use and putting it in a base component. That's where you get the benefits.
Wonderful, Mark. So we have one last question here. What's the best place to find documentation on Sencha?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the best place to go is, or the best place to start is this resources tab. It's not documentation per se. This is more, if I want to get, more of an education. Our official documentation site is docs.sencha.com. And you can see here that, Ext.js is there, Sencha Test, Architect, Sencha Themer, our command line tool that I didn't mention that much, but our command line tool called Sencha Command is here, Sencha Inspector, all the plugins that we have for the various browsers. We even have some Sencha Touch, old Sencha Touch documentation here. So this is the place to go. I mean, if I were to say one place, docs.sencha.com. If you want to see examples, again, it's the same thing. It's examples.sencha.com. And in this case, I can go view examples. And you'll notice here in my description of the two toolkits, we have two different kitchen sinks. We have a modern kitchen sink, modern toolkit kitchen sink, and a classic toolkit kitchen sink. But they both have the same capabilities to go take a look at source code, how you would use them. So those are the two I would say, docs.sencha.com and examples.sencha.com. I use them all the time.
Great. Great, Mark. I think we have a couple of more questions come up
Sure.
here just now. Yeah.
Sure.
Do you have option to import data from Excel into Grid?
We do have an option to import Excel into the grid, like CSV or tab delimited. So yes, that might involve a little bit of development work. We spent most of our time on data in the grid focusing on exporting. So in the Enterprise Edition, and maybe I can show you this really quick here. If I go back over to the kitchen sink here and I go to, I don't know where I'd have, let's say pivot grids and exporter. Okay. So exporting, we spent a lot of time on the importing part as well, but we also can export to all sorts of formats, traditional formats, which means you can do the import in those formats. And we do rich formatting. I think I mentioned this when I was highlighting the pivot grid, that the pivot grid is so valuable that you can give a user analytic capabilities within your application. They want to take that analytics pivot grid to Excel. We can take it to Excel with full fidelity of the Excel pivot table, which is amazing to me. So now this spreadsheet right here is an export of that pivot table, still as a pivot table. So I know you asked about import, but I wanted to focus on both import and export. So yes, pretty rich functionality there. Another reason to choose the Enterprise Edition, because some of those advanced capabilities are there.
Wonderful, Mark. Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think we can take one more question as we have a little time. So if you have Sencha but have not renewed your support, can you download Sencha tools to the point in time that your support expired?
Yes. So as I said, the way we license the product is per developer as a perpetual license. We do have a subscription-based model, but I'll be honest, most people choose the perpetual model. So when you sign up and buy the product, you get 1 year of support included. So while you're in support, whatever version of the product we come out with, you own, and you own it perpetually. So let's say you're going to, for whatever reason, I hope you don't do this, but for whatever reason, you decide not to renew your support. The day before, if 7.5 is out, you are perpetually licensed to 7.5. Support stops. The day after support stops, 7.6 comes out, you are not licensed to 7.6. And not technically, and you can't get back into the support portal because you didn't renew your license. So you have perpetual license to everything while you are under support, but you don't have perpetual access to it if you don't continue your support. There's so many benefits of support, and it's such a little additional cost. Most customers keep support, but to answer that question, that's how it works.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, for a wonderful session today. I think it looks like we have answered all the questions asked at this time. I would like to, wonderful. I would like to remind everyone today's webinar was recorded and you will be receiving a follow-up email with the link of recording shortly. Once again, thank you for attending today's webinar and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.